Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone." The mahogany doors of Sterling Enterprises gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Edward Sterling reviewed the quarterly reports scattered across his glass desk. Numbers didn't lie, unlike people. At 34, he had built an empire through calculated moves and strategic alliances, never allowing emotions to cloud his judgment. The scent of expensive leather from his chair mixed with the faint aroma of black coffee, creating an atmosphere that screamed power and control. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Sterling, Thomas Harrington is here to see you." Edward didn't look up from his papers. Thomas Harrington, once a formidable businessman, now a shadow of his former self. The Harrington mining empire had crumbled under bad investments and market changes. What remained was debt, desperation, and a daughter about whom Edward had heard whispers in Manhattan's elite circles. "Send him in." Thomas entered with the careful steps of a man walking on thin ice. His once commanding presence had withered, replaced by the hunched shoulders of defeat. Gray stubble covered his jaw, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost from stress. "Edward," Thomas's voice carried the weight of old friendship and fresh desperation. "Thank you for seeing me. Have a seat, Thomas." Edward finally looked up, studying his visitor with the same intensity he reserved for hostile takeovers. "I assume this isn't a social call." Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he placed a manila folder on the desk. "I need your help. The banks are calling in my loans. Everything my father built, everything I've worked for, it's all slipping through my fingers." Edward leaned back, fingers interlaced. He'd heard rumors about Harrington's financial troubles, but seeing the desperation in his old friend's eyes was different. Thomas had been his mentor's closest ally, a man who had taught Edward about honor in business, a concept that seemed quaint now. "What exactly are you proposing?" Edward asked, though he suspected where this conversation was heading. "A merger," Thomas said, the word coming out like a sigh. "Your steel operations with our mines. You get direct access to raw materials. I keep the family name alive." Edward drummed his fingers on the desk, the sound echoing in the tense silence. He had already considered this possibility months ago when the first news of Harrington's troubles reached his ears, but now, seeing the broken man before him, a different idea began to form. "And your daughter, Sophia?" Edward asked casually, watching as Thomas stiffened. "I heard she recently graduated from Europe. What does Sophia have to do with this?" Edward stood, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. The city bustled below, each building representing power, ambition, conquest. "Thomas, mergers are complicated. There are issues of trust, loyalty, long-term commitment." He turned, his steel blue eyes fixing on Thomas. "But marriages seal deals in a way that contracts never can." Thomas's face went pale. I'm suggesting a solution that benefits everyone." Edward returned to his chair, his voice taking on the cold, calculating tone he used in all negotiations. "Sophia is educated, comes from a good family, would make a suitable wife for a man in my position. You get not just a business deal, but a son-in-law who will ensure the Harrington name remains respected." Thomas closed his eyes, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "She's my daughter, Edward, not a commodity to be traded." "Don't be sentimental, Thomas. You know how this world works." Edward opened the folder Thomas had brought, quickly scanning the financial documents. The numbers were worse than he'd imagined. "Your daughter will marry eventually. At least this way, she marries into security, status, and you save the legacy your father built." The office fell silent. Except for the barely perceptible hum of the air conditioning, Thomas stared at his hands, decades of pride battling against the brutal reality of his situation. "She doesn't even know me," Thomas murmured. "Knowledge comes with time. Mutual respect, convenience. These are more solid foundations than passion." Edward leaned forward. "Think about it, Thomas. Sophia will have everything a woman could want. Security, social standing, unlimited resources. And you'll sleep knowing you protected both your daughter and your family name." Thomas finally looked up, and Edward could see the exact moment when resistance broke. It was the same expression he'd seen in hundreds of other men, the moment they realized they had no real choice. "What would the terms be?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. "Marriage in 6 weeks, discreet ceremony, immediate family only. In exchange, I take on all of Harrington Mining's debts and incorporate it into Sterling Enterprises. You keep a position as a consultant with a substantial salary. And Sophia, does she have a say in this?" "Sophia is an intelligent woman. She'll understand the advantages." Edward began organizing the papers on his desk, already mentally moving pieces on the board. Besides, Thomas, what's the alternative? Bankruptcy? Watching everything your family built get auctioned off to strangers? The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Thomas knew Edward was right. There were no other options. The banks wouldn't wait, creditors wouldn't show mercy, and pride wouldn't pay bills. I need to talk to her first, Thomas said finally. Naturally. But Thomas, Edward leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his chest. Be clear about the situation. Sophia needs to understand this isn't just about her or about you. It's about the future, about security, about doing the smart thing. Thomas nodded slowly, seeming to have aged 10 years during the conversation. He stood, his legs unsteady, and extended his hand to Edward. You've always been direct, Edward. Maybe too direct. Edward shook the offered hand, his grip firm and confident. The world has no place for sentimentality, Thomas. You taught me that. As Thomas headed for the door, Edward was already thinking about next steps. Sophia Harrington. He had seen her only once at a charity gala the previous year. Dark brown hair, intelligent eyes, impeccable posture. She would be perfect for the role of a CEO's wife. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts and the distant sound of Manhattan traffic below. He had just orchestrated one of the most important acquisitions of his career, and strangely, it didn't feel like a victory. But Edward Sterling didn't allow himself inconvenient feelings. He had a wedding to plan. The chapel of Santa Monica in Beverly Hills emanated a discreet elegance that Edward had carefully chosen. It wasn't ostentatious enough to draw unwanted attention, nor simple enough to compromise his reputation. The aroma of white lilies filled the air, mixing with the subtle scent of polished wood and candle wax. Only 30 guests were present. Immediate family, some essential business partners, and friends whose presence was more protocol than emotional. Edward adjusted his shirt cuff for the third time, a gesture his assistant had noticed, but that he himself wasn't aware of. At 34, he had closed billion-dollar deals without a tremor in his hands. But today, something different hung in the air. Perhaps it was the permanent nature of what he was about to do. Or perhaps it was the uncertainty about the woman who would become his wife in a matter of minutes. She's here, murmured James Carver, his financial director and improvised best man. James had questioned the decision, as he always did with moves he considered too risky. Are you sure about this, Edward? Sure is a strong word, Edward replied, his eyes fixed on the altar. But it's the right decision. The chapel doors opened, and the low murmur of conversation ceased. Thomas appeared first, his face a carefully composed mask of forced dignity. He had lost more weight in the past 6 weeks, and Edward briefly wondered if the man was ill or just consumed by guilt. Then Sophia entered. Edward had seen her before, but not like this. The ivory silk dress contoured her delicate figure without being flashy, the fabric whispering against the marble floor with each measured step. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a low, elegant bun, with a few soft strands framing her face. But it was her eyes that surprised him. There were no tears, no exuberant joy, not even visible nervousness. There was an almost disturbing serenity, as if she had accepted her fate with a resignation that went beyond her years. She walked as if she were in a silent library, her movements contained and graceful. The simple veil didn't hide the neutral expression on her face. Not hostile, not joyful, just present. It was like watching a Renaissance painting come to life, beautiful, immaculate, and emotionally inaccessible. When Thomas handed her over to Edward, their hands briefly touched. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm. She lifted her eyes to meet his for the first time since they had been formally introduced 3 weeks earlier. Edward, she said softly, her voice carrying the subtle trace of a European accent he had forgotten she possessed. Sophia, he studied her face, looking for signs of hesitation or regret. He found only a disconcerting calm. The priest began the ceremony with words that Edward barely registered. His attention was divided between the formalities and the woman beside him. Sophia responded to the priest's commands with quiet precision, as if she were reciting a well-rehearsed lesson. There was no tremor in her voice when she repeated the vows, no dramatic pause, no moment of visible emotion. Do you take Edward Sterling as your lawful husband, to love and honor him in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do. The answer came clear and calm, as if she were confirming a business appointment. Edward felt something strange in his chest, not regret exactly, but an uneasiness he couldn't name. He had expected nervousness, perhaps some silent tears, at least some emotional reaction, but Sophia stood there like a fine porcelain doll, perfect, beautiful, and apparently incapable of breaking. When it was his turn to respond, Edward heard his own voice sound louder than he had intended, as if he were compensating for her emotional silence. "I do." The rings were exchanged with the same mechanical efficiency. Sophia extended her left hand without hesitation, her slender, well-manicured fingers receiving the platinum ring as if it were just another accessory. Edward noticed that she didn't even look at the jewelry, a piece that had cost more than most people earned in a year. "You may kiss the bride." Edward leaned in, his hands lightly touching her shoulders. Sophia didn't pull back, but she didn't move closer either. She simply closed her eyes and tilted her face slightly upward, offering her lips with the same polite courtesy she would use to greet a stranger at a party. The kiss was brief, chaste, more a seal of approval than a gesture of intimacy. When they separated, she opened her eyes and offered a small smile, the first he had seen from her during the entire ceremony. But even that smile seemed rehearsed, as if she had learned to express polite gratitude in the European schools where she had been educated. The applause was polite and brief. Edward observed the guests' faces. Some seemed relieved that the ceremony had ended without drama. Others seemed slightly uncomfortable with the overly formal atmosphere of the event. Thomas was pale but maintained a dignified expression. Sophia's mother, Eleanor, was discreetly dabbing tears with a lace handkerchief. But even her tears seemed more protocol than emotional. During the reception that followed, an elegant but intimate lunch at the adjacent hotel, Sophia moved through the crowd with the grace of someone trained for social events since childhood. She conversed politely with the guests, accepted congratulations with measured smiles, and answered questions about her future plans with vague but satisfactory responses. Edward watched her from a distance, fascinated and slightly frustrated. All the women he had known previously were predictable in their reactions, either too dramatic or too obvious in their intentions, but Sophia was an enigma wrapped in silk and good manners. "She's beautiful," commented Mrs. Bennet, wife of one of Edward's partners, "very composed for someone so young. You make an impressive couple." "Thank you." Edward accepted the compliment, but his eyes remained on Sophia, who was talking with the priest about French literature. He could hear fragments of the conversation. She spoke about Proust with the same neutral tone she had used for her wedding vows. When it came time to cut the cake, Sophia placed her hand over his on the knife, with the precision of someone following strict protocol. The camera flashes captured them smiling, or at least Edward smiling, while Sophia maintained her serene and unreadable expression. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Sterling?" asked one of the photographers. She paused for a moment, as if carefully considering the question. "Grateful," she said finally. "Very grateful." Edward felt that uneasiness again. Grateful. Not happy, not hopeful, not nervous or excited, grateful, as if the marriage were a favor he had granted her, instead of an agreement that benefited both families. As the afternoon progressed, Edward found himself studying his new wife with the same intensity he used to analyze complex financial reports. There were layers to her that he couldn't penetrate, a refined education that created a polished but impenetrable barrier, an intelligence that she kept carefully guarded, and an emotional coldness that rivaled his own. When the last guests departed, and they were alone in the hotel lobby, Edward finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind all day. "Do you have any questions about anything?" Sophia looked at him with those dark, inscrutable eyes. "Should I?" The simplicity of the response disarmed him. She wasn't being insolent or defiant. She genuinely seemed to believe there was nothing about her new life that needed to be discussed or clarified. Most brides have expectations, concerns. "I was well educated, Edward." Her voice was soft but clear. "I understand what my role is." Role. The word echoed in his mind as they headed to the elevator that would take them to the bridal suite. She had turned the marriage into a performance, and apparently was prepared to continue acting indefinitely. As the elevator doors closed, Edward looked at their reflection in the polished metal. They looked perfect together. He, tall and imposing in his dark tuxedo. She, elegant and refined in her wedding dress. They looked like a couple that should be on the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine, but Edward couldn't shake the feeling that he had just married a beautiful stranger, and that perhaps she intended to remain a stranger forever. The doors opened on the 20th floor, revealing a silent hallway that led to their new life. The bridal suite at the Plaza Hotel emanated discreet luxury. Walls in ivory tones, dark mahogany furniture, and a stunning view of Central Park through floor-to-ceiling windows White roses had been strategically placed throughout the room, their soft perfume mixing with the scent of fine leather furniture and the nighttime freshness that entered through the half-open windows. Edward loosened his tie while watching Sophia move through the space with the same measured grace she had displayed all day. She paused at the window, her silhouette outlined against the city lights below, still wearing her wedding dress, though she had removed her veil hours ago. The contrast was striking. The vibrant, pulsing energy of Manhattan at night versus the serene stillness of the woman who had just become his wife. "It's beautiful," she said softly without turning around. "The view." "Yes." Edward approached but maintained a respectful distance. "Would you like to change clothes? I can give you privacy." She finally turned to face him, and for the first time all day, he detected something different in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but a carefully controlled vulnerability that she had kept hidden during the ceremony and reception. "Thank you." Her voice was almost a whisper. "I brought some things." Edward nodded toward the adjacent bathroom. "Make yourself comfortable. There's no rush for anything." As she disappeared behind the marble door, Edward headed to the suite's living area, pouring himself a whiskey from the well-stocked bar. The amber liquid burned slightly going down but couldn't dissipate the strange tension that had settled in his shoulders. He had conducted million-dollar negotiations with less nervousness than he felt in this moment. When Sophia returned 20 minutes later, she wore a light blue silk robe that enhanced the color of her eyes. Her hair was loose now, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and without makeup, she looked even younger. There was something almost ethereal about her, as if she were made of fine porcelain that could break with too firm a touch. "Would you like something? Champagne? Water?" Edward asked, gesturing toward the room service that had been discreetly delivered. "No, thank you." She sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Edward, there's something you should know." He set his glass aside, his attention completely focused on her. "What is it?" Sophia looked at her hands, a slight pink color rising up her neck. "I've never... at the schools where I studied, we were very protected. I don't have experience with." She gestured vaguely between them. Understanding hit Edward like lightning. In all his careful calculations about this marriage, he had assumed that a 2-3-year-old woman, even one educated in convents, would have at least some romantic experience. The possibility that she was completely inexperienced had never crossed his mind. "Sophia," he said gently, moving closer to her, "there are no expectations tonight. We don't need to do anything you don't want to do." She raised her eyes to meet his, and he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Determination. "But we're married now, and I understand there are duties, responsibilities." The word duties struck him strangely. Here was a woman who had turned even marital intimacy into an obligation to be fulfilled. "Sophia, marriage isn't just about duties. There should be connection, mutual pleasure. I don't know how to have pleasure." The admission came so quietly, he almost didn't hear it. Edward sat beside her on the bed, maintaining enough space so she wouldn't feel trapped. "Then maybe we can figure it out together. But only if you want to, not because you feel you should." For a long moment, they sat in silence. Edward could hear the distant traffic below, the barely perceptible hum of the air conditioning, and her soft breathing beside him. There was something deeply intimate about this silence, more intimate than many conversations he'd had. "I want to try," she said finally, "but I don't know how to begin." Edward turned to face her completely. "We can start slowly, with trust." He extended his hand, and after a small hesitation, she placed hers in it. Her skin was soft and cool, her fingers delicate against his. They stayed like this for several minutes, simply getting used to each other's touch. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "A little," she admitted, "but not of you. It's more fear of the unknown." Edward brought her hand to his lips, gently kissing her fingers. He felt a small tremor run through her, but she didn't pull away. "We'll go slowly," he promised. What followed was different from any experience Edward had had before. There was a tenderness he didn't know he possessed, a patience that surprised even himself. Sophia was responsive, but in a quiet, contained way. Small sighs instead of moans, hesitant touches that gradually became more confident. When they finally came together, it was with a gentleness that left Edward feeling strangely vulnerable. Sophia clung to him, her eyes closed, breathing quickened against his ear. There were no words, just the silent language of two bodies, learning each other for the first time. Afterward, they lay in the dark, the only sound being their breathing gradually calming. Sophia was curled against his side, one of her hands resting lightly on his chest. Edward could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin shirt he had put back on. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "Yes." Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. It was. Different from what I expected. Different how? She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. More connected? I thought it would be more clinical. Edward felt something tighten in his chest. Marriage shouldn't be clinical, Sophia. At least not always. She moved slightly to look at him in the dark. "Didn't you plan this as a business transaction?" The question caught him off guard. He had planned exactly that, but now, with her lying beside him, her skin still warm from his touch, the idea seemed obscenely inadequate. "Maybe at first," he admitted, "but people can change their minds. Can they?" There was something almost hopeful in her voice. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with his own conviction. "They can." Sophia snuggled closer, and Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of protection, of wanting to shield this woman from everything that could hurt her. It was unsettling for someone who had spent his entire life thinking only of himself. They fell asleep like this, intertwined in a way that was more intimate than the passion they had shared. And it was only when Edward woke the next morning, golden dawn light filtering through the curtains, that he saw it. Blood. Just a few drops on the pristine white sheets, but enough to make his heart stop. Sophia was still sleeping, her face serene and young in the soft morning light, completely unaware of the revelation she had left behind. Edward stared at the small red stains, his mind racing. She had been a virgin, not just inexperienced, but completely untouched. In a world where he had assumed everyone had secrets and hidden histories, he had married someone who was genuinely pure. The magnitude of what had happened the night before, what he had received, the trust she had placed in him hit him like a wave. Sophia had given him something that could never be returned, something she could never give to anyone else. He looked at her sleeping beside him, her hair spread across the pillow like dark silk, and felt something shift fundamentally inside his chest. This was no longer just a convenient wife or a strategic piece in his business plans. This was a woman who had trusted him completely, and for the first time in his adult life, Edward Sterling felt genuinely responsible for something more precious than money. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet being prepared pulled Edward from a deeper sleep than any he had experienced in months. For a moment, he was disoriented. The smell was domestic, warm, completely different from the sterile hotels or his minimalist Manhattan apartment, where breakfast always arrived on silver trays brought by silent staff. He sat up in bed, immediately noticing that Sophia was no longer beside him. The sheets on her side still held the warmth of her body and a soft trace of her perfume, something floral and discreet that he was beginning to associate specifically with her. Golden morning light filtered through the silk curtains, creating soft patterns on the ivory walls of the suite. Wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt, Edward headed to the living area, where he found a scene that made him stop completely. Sophia had transformed the suite's small dining table into something that looked like it came from a lifestyle magazine. A white tablecloth was spread with military precision, and on it, a careful arrangement that had clearly taken considerable time and thought. There were croissants. Still warm, he could see steam rising delicately, along with small jars of artisanal jam in flavors he recognized as his favorites. Fresh fruit was arranged in an artistic pattern. Strawberries, blueberries, and mango slices, arranged as if they were a painting. Coffee was served in an elegant French press, and beside it, a small pitcher of cream and another of honey. But it was the carefully folded newspaper beside his plate that made him frown. It wasn't just any newspaper. It was the Financial Times, specifically open to the international market section he always read first. How did she know that? "Good morning." Sophia's voice came from the suite's small kitchen, where she was putting the finishing touches on what appeared to be homemade pancakes. She wore a cream silk robe that flowed gracefully as she moved, her hair pulled back in a low, casual bun. "Good morning." Edward approached the table, still processing the scene before him. "Did you make all this?" "Room service brought the basic ingredients, but I prepared some things myself." She approached, carrying a plate of pancakes that emanated the aroma of vanilla and cinnamon. "I hope you don't mind. I'm an early riser." Edward sat down, watching her serve the pancakes with precise, graceful movements. There was something almost ritualistic about the way she prepared each element. Coffee served at the exact temperature, honey warmed just enough to flow smoothly, even the napkin folded in a specific way beside his plate. "How did you know?" he asked, gesturing toward the newspaper and then to the general arrangement. About my preferences. Sophia paused, a slight pink color rising up her neck. I researched after my father mentioned the possibility of marriage. I wanted to know more about you. There are interviews where you mention your morning routines, articles about your eating habits. She sat delicately across the table from him. I hope it's not strange. Edward cut a piece of the pancake, the flavor immediately surprising him. It was light, perfectly seasoned, with a texture that indicated real technique. You cook. The sisters at the convent believed that a complete education included practical skills. Sophia stirred her own coffee delicately. I like the precision required. It's almost like mathematics, but with more tangible results. There was something about the way she said that, the comparison to mathematics, that made Edward look at her with new attention. He had assumed her education had been purely ornamental, the superficial skills that wealthy families traditionally taught their daughters, but there was an analytical mind behind this carefully orchestrated breakfast. Do you like mathematics? He asked. I have a degree in economics from the Sorbonne, she said calmly, with a specialization in emerging markets. Edward almost choked on his coffee. In all the conversations with Thomas, in all the marriage arrangements, no one had mentioned that Sophia possessed serious academic qualifications. He had assumed she was just another high society daughter with a decorative education. Economics, he repeated the word, completely recalibrating his perception of her. And you studied emerging markets specifically. My thesis was on the impact of infrastructure investments on sustainable economic growth in Latin America. She took a sip of coffee, watching his expression over the rim of her cup. I know it wasn't mentioned during the negotiations. My father thought it would be better to emphasize other aspects of my education. Other aspects. Edward felt a pang of irritation, not with her, but with Thomas for omitting such significant information. Like piano and French, I speak 5 languages fluently and have some proficiency in 3 more. Sophia cut her own pancake into small, precise pieces. But yes, I also play piano. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying the woman before him with completely new eyes. The serenity he had interpreted as passivity could actually be carefully contained intelligence. The obedience he had assumed was submission could be strategy. Why didn't you mention any of this yesterday? He asked. You didn't ask. The answer was said without accusation, just as a fact. And frankly, I didn't know if it would be welcome. Many men prefer wives who are less intellectually complicated. The brutal honesty of the statement hit him. She was right. He probably would have been uncomfortable if he had known from the beginning that he was marrying someone who could potentially challenge his views on business. But now, sitting across from her, as she had created a breakfast that demonstrated more attention to detail than many of his employees showed on million-dollar projects, he felt intrigued rather than threatened. And what do you think about the markets currently? He asked, genuinely curious. Sophia's eyes lit up. The first time he had seen a real, unfiltered emotion cross her face. Do you really want to know? Yes. Well, she leaned slightly forward, her posture becoming more animated. I think there's dangerous overvaluation in the tech sector, especially in companies that don't have sustainable revenue models, and the growing dependence on Chinese markets for manufacturing is creating vulnerabilities that most investors are ignoring. Edward found himself nodding. These were points he himself had considered. But hearing them articulated by this woman he had assumed was purely decorative was refreshing. Continue, he said. Sterling Enterprises has smart positions, she said, and he realized she had indeed researched much more than his breakfast preferences. But I would question the expansion into Southeast Asia without first securing solid local partnerships. The political risks are higher than your analysts' projections suggest. Edward paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. She was right. He had been so focused on potential returns that he had given less attention to the political risks she had identified in seconds. You analyzed our reports? Only what's publicly available. Sophia returned her attention to breakfast, as if discussing complex corporate strategy was as natural as commenting on the weather. I hope you don't mind. Old habits. Old habits. He looked at her with growing understanding. I used to help my father with analyses before things got complicated. There was a subtle sadness in her voice. Edward looked at her with growing understanding. Thomas had lost more than money when his business collapsed. He had lost an intellectual partner in his own daughter, and now Edward was beginning to understand that he had received much more in this marriage than he had bargained for. Sophia, he said quietly, why did you agree to marry me? She paused, her coffee cup suspended in the air. To save my father. Only for that? Mostly for that. She placed the cup back on the saucer with a gentle clink. but also because you seemed like someone who could understand me. Eventually. Understand you? How? As someone who sees beyond the surface, who values competence over appearances, she met his eyes across the table. I hope I wasn't wrong. Edward felt something moving in his chest, a mixture of admiration and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. This woman had accepted an arranged marriage, not just out of filial duty, but because she had assessed his character and made a calculated bet on their future. You weren't wrong, he said finally. The smile she gave him then was different from all the previous ones, not polite or rehearsed, but genuine. It completely transformed her face, making her look younger and surprisingly luminous. Well, she said, gesturing toward the breakfast. Then I hope you approve of my first attempt at being a good wife. Edward looked around the table, at the evident care in every detail, at the intelligent woman sitting across from him, at this unexpected domestic intimacy he had never experienced before. More than approve, he said. I'm impressed. And for the first time since he had decided to marry for convenience, Edward wondered if perhaps there was something more powerful than convenience growing between them. The winding road leading to Willow Hill Farm in Vermont was lined with trees in golden and crimson tones, their leaves creating a vibrant mosaic against the crystal blue October sky. Edward drove in comfortable silence, occasionally glancing at Sophia in the passenger seat. She had traded her formal suits for a cream cashmere sweater and dark jeans, the first time he had seen her in truly casual clothes. It's different from Manhattan, she observed when they reached the top of a hill that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. Her voice carried a quality of wonder he rarely heard. Completely different. Edward slowed down to let her absorb the landscape. I bought this property 3 years ago, but I rarely find time to come here. The farm appeared as they rounded a curve, a 19th-century stone house nestled among ancient oaks with well-tended gardens and a stone fence that meandered along the property. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, and Edward noticed how Sophia leaned forward, her eyes lighting up in a way he had never seen before. It's perfect, she said simply. Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper who cared for the property, greeted them on the front porch. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and a warm smile that immediately embraced Sophia. So, this is the new Mrs. Sterling, she said, studying Sophia with maternal approval. Welcome, dear. I hope you like the countryside. Thank you so much, Mrs. Thompson. It's even more beautiful than Edward described. Sophia accepted the older woman's embrace with natural grace that made Edward realize how much he had underestimated her social skills. When Mrs. Thompson left them to get settled, Sophia explored the house with a childlike curiosity that Edward found charming. She touched book spines in the library, admired the exposed ceiling beams, and paused for a long time in front of windows that offered views of the gardens and fields beyond. Did you decorate this yourself? She asked, running her fingers along the surface of an antique oak table. Actually, no. I bought it along with the furniture. Edward sat in a leather armchair near the fireplace. The previous family had lived here for generations. It seemed wrong to change everything. Sophia turned to look at him, something new in her expression. That's surprisingly sentimental of you. Sentimental? Edward frowned. It was a practical decision. Why spend money changing something that already worked? Of course, she said, but there was a small smile playing at her lips. Purely practical. That first afternoon, Edward watched Sophia bloom in a way he hadn't imagined possible. She explored the gardens, chatted with Mrs. Thompson about family recipes, and even convinced Edward to take a walk around the property. As they strolled along trails lined with moss-covered stone walls, she asked questions about the farm's history, about the animals they spotted, about plants she didn't recognize. Have you never spent time in the countryside? Edward asked, watching her bend down to examine a wildflower. Very little. The schools where I studied were mainly in cities. She straightened up, holding the small blue flower. My mother always said the countryside was too rustic for a young lady. And what do you think? Sophia looked around at the rolling hills, the golden fields, the vast sky, and breathed deeply. I think it's liberating. It was that night, after a simple dinner prepared by Mrs. Thompson, that something fundamental shifted between them. They were sitting in the library, a fire crackling softly. Sophia curled over a book she had discovered on the shelves, while Edward reviewed some work documents. Do you know this book? She asked, holding up a leather-bound volume. It's a first edition of Jane Austen's Persuasion. Edward looked up from his papers. It came with the house. It's incredibly valuable, and it's in perfect condition. She leafed through the pages with reverent care, Someone took very good care of this. Do you like Jane Austen? Y adore her. For the first time, Sophia's voice carried genuine enthusiasm. There's something about the way she writes about marriages of convenience that transform into something deeper. She stopped abruptly, realizing the implication of her words. Edward set his documents aside, his attention completely focused on her. Continue, he said softly. Sophia looked at the fire, her cheeks slightly flushed. It's just... She understands that true love can grow between people who initially marry for practical reasons, that sometimes genuinely knowing someone is more powerful than instant passion. Do you believe that? I want to believe it. The admission was so quiet he almost didn't hear her. Edward got up and sat on the sofa beside her, maintaining respectful space but reducing the physical distance between them. Sophia, can I ask you a personal question? She nodded, still looking at the book in her hands. What do you want from life? Not what your parents wanted for you. Not what society expects. What do you really want? The question seemed to surprise her. She was silent for a long time, as if no one had ever asked her that before. I want to matter, she said finally. I want to use my mind for something meaningful. I want to have conversations that challenge my thinking. She paused, struggling with the words, I want to be known, truly known by someone. The raw vulnerability in her voice made something tighten in Edward's chest. And do you feel that you're not known? All my life, people have seen only what they wanted to see. The obedient daughter, the exemplary student, the suitable bride. She finally looked at him. But you, yesterday at breakfast, when you discovered my education, you didn't seem threatened or uncomfortable. You seemed interested. I was interested. I am interested. Why? Edward considered the question carefully. Because you're intelligent in a way that complements my own intelligence, because you see angles I miss, and because, he paused, surprised by his own honesty, because I'm beginning to realize I married someone far more fascinating than I imagined. The smile that lit up Sophia's face was like the sun rising. It wasn't the polite smile she had used during the wedding, not even the genuine but contained smile from breakfast. This was a radiant, transformative smile that completely changed her features and made Edward understand why poets wrote about women who could light up entire rooms. Do you really think that? She asked. I really do. Sophia leaned slightly toward him, the book still in her hands. Edward, can I say something that might sound presumptuous? Please. I think you're not who you appear to be either. Edward frowned. What do you mean? Everyone sees you as this cold, calculating tycoon, and you are strategic. Definitely, but... She gestured around the cozy library. A truly cold man wouldn't preserve the history of a house he bought, wouldn't care that Mrs. Thompson feels like part of the family, wouldn't drive slowly on a country road to let his wife admire the scenery. Edward felt exposed under her analytical gaze. Maybe I'm just practical, or maybe you're kind in a way you don't know how to express. Sophia set the book aside and turned to face him completely. You were incredibly patient with me on our first night, gentler than I expected. The mention of their intimacy brought a new awareness of the space between their bodies on the sofa. Edward was conscious of her subtle perfume, of how the fire gilded her skin, of the vulnerability in her eyes. Sophia, he said softly, may I kiss you? The question surprised her. Not because it was asked, but because of how it was asked, with permission, with consideration, as if her opinion mattered. Yes, she whispered. This kiss was different from the chaste kiss of their wedding. It was exploratory, curious, a question asked with lips and answered with a soft sigh. When they separated, Sophia was blushing, but she didn't lower her eye. That was, she began. Different. Edward finished. Better. They spent the rest of the evening talking about books, about trips they'd like to take, about ideas and dreams they had never shared with anyone else. And when they finally went upstairs to the bedroom, it was hand in hand, like a couple beginning to discover that perhaps they had more in common than either of them had dared to hope. For the first time since the wedding, Edward fell asleep thinking not about business strategies or next corporate moves, but about the woman beside him, and the surprising possibility that perhaps there was something deeper growing between them than any business agreement could have predicted. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday, 3 weeks after their return from Vermont. Edward was at his desk reviewing contracts when his assistant announced that Thomas Harrington was on the line, her voice carrying an urgency that immediately put Edward on alert. Edward, I need to see you. It's about Silver Ridge. Thomas's voice sounded weak, more fragile than Edward remembered. There are things you need to know before it's too late. Silver Ridge, The silver mines that had been the heart of the Harrington Empire for 3 generations. Edward had assumed they were simply exhausted, part of the reason the company had collapsed, but there was something in Thomas's voice that suggested a more complex story. Where do you want to meet? My house. And Edward, bring Sophia. She has a right to know, too. 2 hours later, Edward and Sophia were sitting in the library of the Harrington mansion, a house that had seen better days with covered furniture and dusty paintings that spoke of past glories. Thomas received them at the door, and Edward was shocked by the man's physical transformation. He had lost even more weight. His skin had a sickly pallor, and there was a tremor in his hands that hadn't been present in Edward's office months ago. Father. Sophia stood immediately, concern clear in her voice. Are you okay? You look sick. Thomas finished with a weak smile. Because I am, dear. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia went pale, her hand automatically seeking Edward's for support, which he took without hesitation. How long have you known? Edward asked, his mind already processing the implications. 3 months. About a week before I approached you about the marriage. Thomas settled heavily into his leather armchair, suddenly looking much older than his 62 years. 6 months, maybe 8, if I'm lucky. That's why I needed to ensure Sophia was protected. Sophia covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling silently. Edward put an arm around her, surprised by the naturalness of the protective gesture. Father, why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice muffled. Because you would have married out of pity, not necessity. And I needed you to have a real chance at happiness, not just security. Thomas looked between the two of them, noticing how Edward kept Sophia close, and from what I can see, perhaps it worked better than I hoped. Edward felt Sophia lean against him, seeking comfort, and he tightened his embrace slightly. You said there was something about Silver Ridge we needed to know. Thomas nodded, and with trembling hands, withdrew a thick folder from his desk. That's why I called you here. Silver Ridge didn't fail because of depleted resources. It failed because I discovered we had been operating illegally for decades. He opened the folder, revealing documents, photographs, and reports that had clearly been organized with meticulous care. My father, Sophia's grandfather, made deals in the 70 seconds and 80 seconds that violated environmental regulations. Toxic waste dumping, operations without proper licensing, bribing local inspectors. Edward leaned forward, studying the documents. As a CEO, he immediately recognized the gravity of what he was seeing. Why didn't you rectify the operations when you discovered this? I tried, but the cost of cleanup and regularization was greater than the entire value of the company. And there was more. Thomas turned a page, revealing photographs of a poor, rural community, an entire village downstream from our operations, children being born with birth defects, adults developing cancer at abnormal rates, contaminated water supply. Sophia raised her head, looking at the photographs with growing horror. Our money, our education, all of it came from this. Not all of it, but a significant part. Yes, Thomas met his daughter's eyes. I shut down operations immediately when I discovered this, but the damage was already done, and facing the legal consequences would have meant not just bankruptcy, but prison. Edward studied the documents with the analytical mind he applied to all business problems. What's the estimated liability between environmental cleanup, compensation for the affected community, and regulatory fines? About $200 million. The figure hung in the air like a bomb. It was substantial even for Sterling Enterprises, but not impossible to manage if spread over several years. Why are you telling us this now? Edward asked. Thomas leaned back in his chair, seeming exhausted by the weight of carrying this secret. Because when I die, this problem becomes yours, Edward. Legally, as Sophia's husband, you inherit not just the remaining assets of Harrington Mining, but also its liabilities. And because, he paused, looking directly at Edward, because I hope you're a better man than my father was, and better than I was. What do you mean? I want you to do what I should have done years ago. Face the consequences. Clean up the environment. Compensate the families that were harmed. Thomas leaned forward, his voice gaining intensity. I know it's a lot of money, but you have resources. And more importantly, you have the opportunity to do what's right. Edward looked at Sophia, who was studying the photographs of the affected community with an expression of pain and determination he recognized from himself when facing difficult decisions. If we do this, Edward said calmly, it will be public. There will be investigations, media attention, possible criminal action against the company, even if it's historical. I know, and you're asking me to essentially confess to corporate crimes I didn't commit. I'm asking you to clean up a mess my family created. I'm asking you to give these people the justice they deserve." Thomas paused, his next words coming as a whisper. "And I'm asking you to do this so Sophia can live without carrying the weight of her grandfather's sin." Sophia finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Edward, if you decide not to do this, I'll understand. It's not your responsibility to correct my family's mistakes." Edward looked at her. This woman who had married him to save her father, who had discovered the sordid truth about the origin of her wealth and still maintained her dignity intact. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to do what's right," she said simply. "Even if it costs us everything." The moral simplicity of her response hit him like a punch. In a world where he was used to navigating shades of gray, where every decision was weighed against profits and losses, here was a woman asking him to simply do the right thing regardless of cost. Thomas watched the exchange between them, and Edward saw something like hope arise in his tired eyes. "There's one more thing," Thomas said, withdrawing a sealed envelope from his desk. "My will. I've left everything to Sophia, of course. But there's also a letter for both of you." He handed the envelope to Sophia, who held it as if it were made of glass. "You can read it now, or after I pass, but there's something I need to say while I still can." Thomas looked directly at Edward. "I arranged this marriage out of desperation, it's true, but also because I saw something in you, Edward, a fundamental decency that you hide behind all that corporate efficiency." Edward frowned. "Thomas, let me finish." Thomas raised a trembling hand. "I know you could see this Silver Ridge problem as just another business decision, weigh the costs against the benefits. But I also know you're capable of more than that." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of a final request. "Don't just take care of her, Edward. Try to love her. She deserves to be loved for who she really is, not just protected like a valuable asset." The request hung in the air between them, more intimate and powerful than any business contract. Edward felt Sophia stiffen beside him, clearly uncomfortable being discussed as if she weren't present, but also hopeful in a way she was trying to hide. "Thomas," Edward said finally, "I can't promise love, but I can promise that she will be respected, protected, and valued." And as for Silver Ridge, he looked again at the documents, at the photographs of affected families, at Sophia beside him. "I'll do what's right, even knowing what it will cost, especially knowing what it will cost." Thomas closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, Edward saw genuine peace cross his features. "Thank you," he whispered. As they left the Harrington house an hour later, Sophia was silent. The envelope from the will pressed against her chest. Edward drove in silence, processing the magnitude of what he had just accepted, not just the financial and legal challenge of Silver Ridge, but the emotional responsibility Thomas had placed on his shoulders. "Edward," Sophia said finally when they reached his apartment, "you don't have to do this. Silver Ridge, you could just let the lawyers handle it." Edward stopped the car and turned to face her. "Is that what you want me to do?" "I want you to do only what you can live with yourself doing." The response surprised him with its maturity. It wasn't an emotional plea or moral manipulation. It was simply a woman giving him the freedom to choose who he wanted to be. "Then I'll do the right thing," he said, "because I've discovered I can live better with myself when I do." The smile she gave him was small but radiant. "I knew you would." "How did you know?" "Because," she said, placing her hand over his, "you're a better man than you think you are." That night, as they lay in bed, Edward reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in the past few weeks. He had married expecting to acquire a convenient wife, and instead had found an intellectual partner, a moral dilemma that would test all his values, and something that was beginning to look dangerously like true love. The question was he ready for all these transformations? Edward's office the following Monday seemed different, not physically, but energetically. The same glass walls offered the familiar view of Manhattan. The same reports awaited his attention, but something fundamental had shifted in the perspective of the man sitting behind the mahogany desk. The revelations about Silver Ridge weighed on his mind like a complex equation that required more than financial analysis to solve. James Carver entered unceremoniously, carrying the monthly folder of potential acquisitions. "Good morning, Edward. We have an interesting opportunity in the pharmaceutical sector." "James, I need to talk to you about something first." Edward gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Silver Ridge." James's face immediately closed off. "You can't be serious about getting involved with that mess, Edward. The numbers you showed me are devastating. $200 million in environmental and criminal liabilities. It's financial suicide. It's the right thing to do. The right thing? James leaned forward, disbelief clear in his voice. Edward, since when is the right thing a business decision parameter for you? We run a corporation, not a charity. Edward studied his financial director, a man he had worked with for 8 years, someone who knew every aspect of how he operated. James was right about one thing. This wasn't a decision the Edward of 6 months ago would have made. James, how many families depend on Sterling Enterprises for their livelihood? Counting direct employees and their families, suppliers, and local economy, probably about 50,000 people, and if we could ensure that none of those families would ever suffer what the families near Silver Ridge suffered: sick children, contaminated water, destroyed futures, wouldn't that have value? James rubbed his temples. Edward, you're talking like you've developed a conscience overnight. Maybe I have, because of your wife. The question was asked with a slightly accusatory tone that made Edward stiffen. Because of my wife, yes, but not in the way you're insinuating. Sophia didn't manipulate me into this decision. She showed me there's a different way to view corporate responsibility. Edward stood and walked to the window, watching the frantic movement of the city below. James, for 34 years, I believed success meant maximizing profits, minimizing risks, and always thinking 3 moves ahead. And it worked. We built an empire. So why change now? Because I discovered there's a different kind of wealth, and that some things are worth more than money. Edward turned to face James. Prepare the documents to begin the Silver Ridge cleanup process. I want a team of environmental lawyers, remediation specialists, and a compensation fund for affected families. James was silent for a long moment. And if the board opposes, then I convince them. And if I can't convince them, I find a new board. James. James paused, as if weighing his words carefully. Are you sure you're not confusing personal attraction with business judgment? The question was fair, but Edward had already questioned himself about this repeatedly over the past few days. It's not about attraction, James. It's about who I want to be when I look in the mirror, and about what kind of man I want to be for my wife. That afternoon, Edward did something he had never done in 8 years. He canceled his remaining meetings and left the office at 4. He found Sophia at home, bent over books scattered across the dining table, working on what appeared to be intensive academic research. You left early, she observed, looking up when he entered. I wanted to be home with you. The admission surprised him as much as it did her. What are you working on? Sophia gestured to the books and documents around her, researching cases similar to Silver Ridge. Legal precedents, successful remediation strategies, compensation structures that actually worked for affected communities. Edward sat beside her, studying her work. It was meticulous, comprehensive, exactly the kind of analysis he would pay thousands of dollars for specialized consultants to perform. You did all this today? I wanted to help. I know this decision isn't easy for you. She paused, her hands resting on a particularly thick report. And I wanted you to know there are ways to do this that minimize the impact on our employees and shareholders. Edward picked up one of the reports she had prepared, impressed by the depth of analysis. Sophia, this is professional-level work. Why didn't you consider a career in environmental consulting? Because I was Thomas Harrington's daughter, expected to marry well and maintain the family name. There was a hint of bitterness in her voice. But now, maybe I can do something more. What do you mean? Sophia straightened up, a new determination in her posture. I want to be part of the Silver Ridge project. Not as your wife offering moral support, but as a partner contributing real expertise. The idea surprised him, but also intrigued him. You'd face public scrutiny, media attention, possibly hostility from people who blame your family for the original damage. I know, but Edward, this mess was created by my surname. I want it cleaned up by my surname too. Edward studied her face, seeing the resolve he recognized from himself when making difficult decisions. Are you sure? Completely. That night, they worked side by side, Edward sharing details about Sterling Enterprises' corporate structure, while Sophia explained the nuances of environmental regulations she had studied. It was an intimacy different from anything Edward had experienced, not physical, but intellectual and emotional. Edward, Sophia said during a break in their work, can I ask something personal? Of course. When you decided to do what my father asked, was it because you feel obligated to me? Because of our marriage? The question made him pause. It was something he had considered extensively. Initially, maybe, but that's not why I'm doing it now. Then why? Edward set his pen aside and turned to face her completely. Because for the first time in my life, I care more about being right than being correct. And because, he paused, struggling with words for feelings that were still new to him. Because I want to be the kind of man who deserves you. Sophia grew very quiet. Edward, you don't need to deserve me. We made an agreement. Remember? The agreement changed. How? Because you changed. You transformed from a convenient obligation into... He searched for the right words. Into someone I admire. Someone whose respect I want to earn. Someone who makes me want to be better. Sophia's cheeks flushed slightly. You're already better than you think. I'm better when I'm with you. The moment stretched between them. Charged with an emotional intimacy deeper than any physical passion, Edward found himself leaning toward her, drawn not just by her beauty, but by the strength of character she had consistently demonstrated. Sophia, he said softly, this feeling that's growing between us, do you feel it too? You mean love. The word came out as a whisper. I mean something I don't know how to name. Something that makes me want to rush home every night. Something that makes me want to be honest about who I really am. Sophia placed her hand over his. I feel it too. And it scares me. Why does it scare you? Because it changes everything. Our agreement was simple, clear, safe. But this, she gestured between them. This is complex and uncertain and too important to treat lightly. Edward turned his hand upward, intertwining his fingers with hers. Maybe it's time to make a new agreement. What kind of agreement? One where we try to figure out what this is between us. Where we stop acting like we're just business partners and start acting like people who care about each other. And if it doesn't work? And if it does? The smile that lit up Sophia's face was radiant. Then maybe we found something that not even the best written contract could have guaranteed. That night, when they went to bed, it was with a new understanding between them. They were no longer strangers fulfilling matrimonial obligations, but two people who were beginning to build something real together. And for the first time since becoming CEO, Edward fell asleep thinking not about business strategies, but about the woman beside him and the surprising possibility that perhaps true love was the smartest investment he had ever made. The cream-colored envelope from New York University arrived on a Thursday in March, 2 months after Edward had officially begun the Silver Ridge remediation project. Sophia held the correspondence with slightly trembling hands, immediately recognizing the golden logo embossed on the high-quality paper. What is it? Edward asked, noticing her expression while sorting through his own mail at breakfast. A response. She ran her finger along the sealed envelope, hesitating. A few weeks ago, I sent some translations I did of French economic texts to NYU's Comparative Literature Department. They were looking for someone for a special project. Edward set his papers aside, giving her his full attention. In the weeks since Silver Ridge, he had become increasingly attuned to moments when Sophia demonstrated independent initiative and had learned to recognize when something was truly important to her. What kind of project? Translation and analysis of 18th and 19th century economic manuscripts, mainly French and German texts, that have never been translated into English. Sophia finally opened the envelope, her eyes quickly scanning the letter. They're offering me a position. The surprise in her voice made Edward look more closely at the letter in her hands. What kind of position? Visiting associate researcher, part-time initially, with possibility of expansion if the project is successful. Sophia looked up to meet his eyes, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty in her expression. Edward, they want me to lead a small team to choose which texts to translate, to develop the analysis methodology. Edward felt something expand in his chest. Pride, yes, but also something deeper. Over the past months, he had watched Sophia bloom from a silently obedient wife into an intellectual partner. But this represented something even greater. External recognition of her professional value. Is this what you want? He asked. More than anything, she replied without hesitation, then paused. But I wanted to discuss it with you first. I know there are expectations about how a wife should divide her time. Edward stood and approached her, taking the letter to read the details. The offer was impressive, not just in terms of prestige, but also in the responsibility they were offering someone without formal prior academic experience. Sophia, this is extraordinary. They must be really impressed with your work. Do you think so? There was a vulnerability in her voice that made him realize how much this opportunity meant to her. I know so. He returned the letter and placed his hands on her shoulders. And I want you to accept it, even if it means you'll be less available, less focused on being a traditional wife. The question hit him with its raw honesty. Sophia was offering him the chance to keep her in the safe, predictable box of convenient wife, but Edward discovered the idea made him slightly nauseous. Sophia, over the past months, you've become my partner in the Silver Ridge project, my confidant in difficult business decisions, and... He paused, searching for the right words. And the person whose opinion I value most, why would I want you to be less than that? The smile that lit up her face was transformative. So, you really don't mind? I mind very much. I mind that you have something that's completely yours, something where you can shine independently of me or anyone else. That afternoon, Sophia called to accept the position. Edward watched from the doorway of his home office as she spoke with the professor in charge of the project, noticing how her posture changed more upright, more confident, with an energy he rarely saw when she was dealing with social aspects of being his wife. When do you start? He asked after she hung up. Monday next week. They want me to begin with an analysis of an Adam Smith text that's never been completely translated. Sophia turned to face him, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Edward, do you realize I'll be working with ideas that shape how we understand economics, but that have been lost in translation for centuries? The passion in her voice awakened something in him, not jealousy of her work, but admiration for the intensity of her intellectual commitment. It was the same energy he felt when solving complex business problems, and recognizing it in Sophia created an even deeper connection between them. Sophia's first week at NYU brought a noticeable change to their entire domestic dynamic. She left in the morning with a focused energy Edward recognized from himself on important negotiation days, and returned in the evening with stories about textual discoveries, academic debates, and insights she had developed. The Smith text on moral theory I'm translating, she said during dinner on her first Friday, argues that sympathy, not self-interest, is the basis of ethical economic judgments. It's revolutionary when you consider how it applies to situations like Silver Ridge. Edward paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Explain. Well, Smith suggests that truly rational economic decisions must consider the impact on others as if it were the impact on ourselves. So, your decision to remediate Silver Ridge wasn't just ethically correct, it was economically rational in the deepest sense. The analysis surprised him. Sophia was applying 18th century economic theory to validate 21st century decisions in a way he had never considered. And your colleagues, what do they think about you starting without formal academic experience? Initially, there was skepticism, Sophia admitted, but Professor Hartwell, he heads the department, said my outsider perspective is actually an advantage, that I see connections that career academics might miss. As the weeks passed, Edward watched Sophia gain confidence in ways that went far beyond work. She began expressing opinions about current events during dinner, offered insights about Sterling Enterprises' business strategies, and even began gently challenging some of his decisions when she disagreed. Edward, she said one April evening while reviewing Silver Ridge reports, have you considered implementing a long-term community monitoring program? What do you mean? Instead of just remediating and compensating, what if we established a system where the affected community had ongoing input into our operation, where they were partners in the healing process, instead of just recipients of compensation? The suggestion was brilliant, something neither he nor his expensive consultants had considered. Where did this idea come from? From my work with texts on community economics, there are fascinating historical precedents for this kind of participatory partnership. Sophia leaned forward, enthusiasm clear in her voice. And I know some people at the university who could help develop the framework. Edward found himself nodding before he had even fully processed the proposal. Do it. Develop a complete proposal. Are you sure? Wouldn't it be presumptuous? Sophia, over the past weeks, your ideas have been consistently better than those of consultants. I pay fortunes. Why wouldn't I want your input? The transformation Edward observed in Sophia over the following months was remarkable. She developed a presence that was simultaneously graceful and authoritative, a confidence that came from knowing her ideas had value. When she accompanied Edward to business events, she now participated in conversations about economics and politics with a sophistication that impressed even experienced executives. Your wife is remarkable, commented Robert Callahan, CEO of a rival technology company, after a charity gala, where Sophia had discussed sustainable economic theory with a group of industry leaders. Where did you find her? She found me, Edward replied, watching Sophia animatedly converse with a Harvard professor about translating historical texts. Or maybe we found each other, but it was on a May evening, 3 months after Sophia had started at NYU, that Edward truly understood the full impact of her transformation. They were at home, Working side by side, he on Sterling Enterprises reports, she on her latest translation. When she paused and looked at him, Edward, can I say something that might sound strange? Always. I feel like myself. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm being who I really am, instead of who other people expect me to be. Edward set his papers aside, giving her his full attention. And who are you really? Someone who loves ideas, someone who wants to contribute to important conversations, someone who, she paused, searching for words, someone who can be a real partner, not just a decorative wife. You have always been a real partner, Sophia. You just found ways to express that which go beyond our marriage. That's exactly it. And Edward, she placed her hand over his. Thank you for letting me find this, for not trying to keep me small or safe or limited. Edward intertwined his fingers with hers, feeling the truth of what she had said resonate through him. He had married expecting a convenient wife, but had found an intellectual partner, a professional collaborator, and a woman whose growing independence made him admire her even more. Sophia, he said softly, watching you flourish this way, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. The kiss they shared then was different from all the previous ones, not born of duty or even passion, but of mutual admiration and deep respect for what each had become in the presence of the other. And for the first time, Edward understood that true love wasn't about possessing someone, but about celebrating who they became when they were free to be completely themselves. The June rain drummed softly against the apartment windows as Edward watched Sophia move through the kitchen, preparing dinner with the same meticulous precision she applied to everything in her life. They had been married almost 8 months, and he had spent the past week struggling with words that seemed simultaneously inevitable and terrifying. The community monitoring project was officially approved today, Sophia said. Lighting candles on the dining table, she had set with characteristic care. The NYU team will start field visits next week. That's wonderful. Edward poured wine into 2 glasses, watching how the candlelight gilded her skin. You must be proud. It was your vision from the beginning. Our vision, she corrected, meeting his eyes across the table. I never could have implemented this without your support. Edward felt that familiar tightness in his chest, a mixture of admiration, pride, and something deeper he was finally ready to name. Over the past months, watching Sophia grow in confidence and expertise had awakened feelings in him that went far beyond respect or physical attraction. They dined with the easy conversation that had developed between them. Discussions about her work at the university, Silver Ridge updates, observations about books they were reading, but Edward was only half present in the conversation, his mind preparing and rehearsing words he had never said to anyone before. Edward, Sophia said, tilting her head slightly. Are you okay? You seem distant tonight. Actually, he said, setting his wine glass aside. There's something I need to tell you. Something in his tone made Sophia pause, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. That sounds serious. It is serious. Edward leaned forward, his hands resting on the table between them. Sophia, when we got married, I thought I knew exactly what I was doing. A business deal, a convenient alliance, mutual benefit. A shadow crossed her face. Edward, if you're having regrets. No, he interrupted immediately. I'm not having regrets. I'm trying to tell you that everything has changed. Sophia set her fork aside, her attention completely focused on him. Changed how? Edward took a deep breath, feeling as if he were about to jump off a cliff without knowing if there was a safety net waiting for him. Changed because I fell in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, simple and transformative. Sophia went completely still, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether she had heard correctly. Edward, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Let me finish, he said softly. I fell in love with the way your mind works, with your compassion when we discovered Silver Ridge, with your courage in taking a job that challenged you. I fell in love with the woman who prepares breakfast like it's art, who translates 200-year-old texts like she's unraveling secrets of the universe. Tears began forming in Sophia's eyes, but she didn't look away. I fell in love, Edward continued, his own voice growing thicker with emotion, with the way you made me want to be a better man, not out of obligation or strategy, but because you made me realize I could be more than just an efficient businessman. Edward. Sophia reached across the table, and he took her hand immediately. I know this wasn't in our original agreement, he said. I know you married me to save your father, and I married you for convenience. But Sophia, I can't pretend anymore that this is just a business arrangement when I wake up every morning grateful that you're beside me. A tear rolled down her cheek. "Are you sure? It's not just gratitude or habit or—" "I'm sure." Edward squeezed her hand. "Sophia, I love you. Not the idea of you, not what you represent, but you, your intelligence, your kindness, your strength, the way you laugh when you find a particularly elegant passage in an ancient text, the way you frown when you're thinking about something complex." Sophia closed her eyes, more tears flowing silently. "Edward, she began. "You don't need to say anything," he said quickly. "I'm not saying this to pressure you or to change our dynamic. I'm saying it because you deserve to know, because keeping it secret started to feel dishonest. And our partnership has always been built on honesty." Sophia opened her eyes, and what he saw there made him stop breathing. It wasn't pity or discomfort or even surprise. It was something that looked like relief mixed with a tentative joy she was trying to contain. "Edward," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Can I confess something too?" He nodded, unable to speak. "I fell in love with you too." The words hit him like lightning. "You? What?" "I fell in love with the man who gave me freedom to grow instead of keeping me small, who supported my dreams even when they complicated our life, who chose to do what was right with Silver Ridge, even knowing what it would cost." Sophia leaned forward, her hands gripping his. "I fell in love with the man who sees me, really sees me, instead of just seeing a role I should play." Edward felt something expand in his chest, a sense of completeness he had never experienced before. "When did you know?" "I think I started to suspect in Vermont, when you let me simply be myself, but I knew for certain the night you decided to take on Silver Ridge, when you chose ethics over profit, when you showed you were capable of change." She paused, a small but radiant smile curving her lips. "And when did you know for certain that you loved me?" "When? This afternoon. When you called just to ask how my presentation at the university went. When you got genuinely excited when I told you about the positive response I received. When I realized you're proud of my success, not because it reflects well on you, but because you want me to be happy." Edward stood and walked around the table, pulling her to stand as well. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, processing the magnitude of what had just been confessed. "So, our official business agreement is dissolved?" he asked, his hands finding her face. "Completely null and void," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "And what do we do now?" "Now," Sophia said, her arms circling his neck, "we make a new agreement, one based on love, mutual respect, and the promise that we'll keep growing together. What terms do you propose?" "Complete honesty, unconditional support for each other's dreams." And she paused, her eyes dancing with a joy that completely transformed her face. "And the promise that we'll never again pretend this is just convenience, when we both know it's so much more." "I accept all terms," Edward said, leaning down to kiss her. This kiss was different from all they had shared before. It wasn't driven by duty or physical passion, or even growing affection. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, that marked the end of an arranged marriage and the beginning of a chosen union. When they separated, both were laughing through tears of joy. "Do you realize," Sophia said, her hands resting on his chest, "that this makes everything much more complicated?" "How so?" "Because now we have something real to lose. Something that matters more than money or status or convenience." Edward nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "But you know what I think?" "What?" "I think the things worth having always come with risk. And Sophia," he paused, looking at the woman in his arms, his wife by choice now, not by circumstance, "you are worth any risk." That night, they made love with an intimacy that went beyond the physical. It was a celebration, a promise, and a discovery that true love was even more powerful than either of them had imagined. And when they fell asleep intertwined, it wasn't as two business partners sharing a bed, but as two people who had found in each other something they didn't know they were looking for. A true emotional home. The agreement had become love, and love had become the foundation of everything they would build together from that point forward. A year and a half after the day Edward Sterling had proposed a marriage of convenience to Thomas Harrington, he found himself standing on the porch of Willow Hill Farm, watching the golden September sun paint Vermont's fields in shades of amber and gold. It was hard to believe that the man who had made that calculated proposal was the same person now anxiously awaiting his wife's arrival, who was driving from Manhattan after presenting her latest research at NYU. The transformation hadn't been just personal. On the clipboards beside him rested the final reports from the Silver Ridge project, an initiative that had cost Sterling Enterprises $230 million but had resulted in something no amount of money could buy: genuine redemption, The affected community now had clean water, subsidized medical care, and an educational program that would ensure the next generations had opportunities their parents never had. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, Mrs. Thompson announced, appearing on the porch with a warm smile that had become as familiar as it was comforting. "And I can tell your wife is going to love the surprise you prepared." Edward smiled, touching the small velvet ring box in his pocket. It wasn't an engagement ring, they were already married, after all, but something more significant. A ring he had specially made, engraved with a line from Sophia's translation of Adam Smith. "True wealth lies in the ability to create value for others." The sound of a car on the gravel driveway made his heart race, in a way that still surprised him after 18 months of marriage. Sophia emerged from the car with the vibrant energy he had learned to associate with her most productive days at the university. She wore a simple navy blue dress and cream cardigan, but to Edward, she was more stunning than any magazine model. "How was the presentation?" he asked, coming down the steps to meet her. "Incredible." Sophia threw herself into his arms with an enthusiasm that made him laugh. "Edward, they want to expand the project, not just for French and German texts, but for a complete multilingual translation initiative." And she paused, her eyes shining with barely contained excitement. "They want me to head the entire department." Edward spun her in the air, his joy for her success, genuine and deep. "That's wonderful. You deserve every bit of recognition. There's more," she said, when he set her back down. "They want to create a chair in applied historical economics, essentially using ancient texts to inform modern business practices, like what we did with Silver Ridge." "And did you accept?" "I said I needed to discuss it with my husband first." Sophia smiled, but there was an underlying seriousness in her voice, because it would mean more responsibility, more travel to conferences, more time away from home. Edward placed his hands on her shoulders, studying her face. "Sophia, what do you want to do?" "I want to accept, but only if you're okay with it." "I'm more than okay with it. I'm proud." He paused, then smiled mischievously. "Actually, I have a business proposal for you." "A business proposal?" Sophia arched an eyebrow. "That sounds familiar." Sterling Enterprises is considering establishing a foundation focused on business ethics and social responsibility. We're looking for someone to lead it, someone with experience in both economic theory and practical implementation. Sophia's eyes widened. "Edward, are you offering?" "I'm offering a partnership, a real one. This time not arranged." Edward took her hands. "You would run the foundation, define its mission, choose its projects. We'd work together, but you'd have complete autonomy. And if I accept the NYU position too, then you do both, or we find a way to integrate the two." "Sophia," he squeezed her hands, "I've learned that when you have an extraordinary partner, you create ways to maximize her potential, not limit it." The smile she gave him was radiant. "You realize this means we'd be working together, professionally and personally. Scary, isn't it?" "Terrifying," she agreed, still smiling. "And perfect." They walked hand in hand toward the house, but Edward paused on the porch. "Sophia, there's something else." "What?" Edward withdrew the small velvet box from his pocket. "I know we're already married, but our first marriage was based on a contract. I want to give you something that symbolizes our choice to be together." Sophia held her breath as he opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a single blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "Edward, it's beautiful. Read the engraving." She tilted the ring toward the light, and Edward saw the moment she recognized the words from her own translation. "True wealth lies in the ability to create value for others." She read aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "You taught me that," Edward said softly, sliding the ring onto her finger beside her wedding band. "That true success isn't about what you accumulate, but about what you contribute." Sophia looked at the ring, then at him, tears shining in her eyes. "Edward Sterling, you've become the most romantic man when you weren't paying attention. I've become many things when I wasn't paying attention. Mainly someone who can't imagine life without you." They kissed as the sun set behind Vermont's mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a kiss that sealed not just their love, but their partnership, professional, personal, and deeply true. During dinner, they made plans. Sophia would accept both the NYU position and leadership of the Sterling Foundation. They would divide their time between Manhattan and Vermont, using the farm as a retreat where they could work on special projects, and next year they would make their first trip together to Silver Ridge to see firsthand the community they had helped heal. "You know what else has changed?" Sophia asked as they cleaned dishes together, a domestic routine they had developed, and that Edward had come to value more than any formal dinner. What? I used to think security meant not having to take risks. But now I realize that true security comes from knowing you have someone who will support you through any risk worth taking. Edward paused in drying the plate in his hands. And I used to think control meant planning every possible outcome. But now I realize the best things in life are the ones you never could have planned. Like us. Especially like us. That night, they sat in the library where they had first truly connected. Sophia bent over her latest manuscripts while Edward reviewed proposals for the new foundation. But unlike those early nights when they worked side by side, now there was an ease between them, a synchronization that came from true partnership. Sophia, Edward said, looking up from his papers. Thank you. For what? For teaching me that the best deal I ever made wasn't a business agreement. It was choosing to love you. Sophia set her pen aside and looked at him with that smile he had learned to provoke, but that still hit him like lightning every time. Edward Sterling, she said, I love you too. Not because I have to, but because I choose to every day. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, creating a soft symphony against the windows. Inside, two people who had started as strangers in a convenient arrangement had found something no contract could have guaranteed, a love that was simultaneously chosen and inevitable, practical and deeply romantic. And as they prepared for bed that night, Edward reflected on how his definition of success had completely changed. Success was no longer measured only in profits or acquisitions, but in the quality of relationships you built, the positive impact you had on the world, and the depth of connection you shared with the person you chose as your life partner. He had begun this journey looking for a convenient wife, and had found an extraordinary life partner. He had started looking for a business deal, and had found a love that defied all logic, but made perfect sense. Edward Sterling had finally learned that the best investment any person could make was in another human being, and that the return on that investment was immeasurable, infinite, and absolutely transformational. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the most practical reasons. Edward and Sophia discovered that an arranged marriage can transform into the truest love when two people choose to see beyond appearances, when they decide to grow together instead of simply coexisting. They learned that vulnerability is strength, that changing your mind is wisdom, and that real love doesn't happen in a magical moment. It's built day after day in small gestures of understanding and great acts of courage. Edward's transformation from a cold CEO to a man capable of deep love reminds us that it's never too late to discover who we really are. And Sophia's journey from silent obedience to radiant confidence shows us that sometimes we need someone who believes in us to discover our own strength. In the end, they found something money could never buy. A partnership that challenged them to be better. A love that freed them to be authentic. And the certainty that they had found in each other, not just a spouse, but a true home. Because perhaps, deep down, we're all looking for someone who sees us completely, deeply, without masks, and still chooses to stay.